Welcome back to Breathing Underwater's Moviecast. I am Dan. How's it? I wasn't planning on making this episode at any point, but my wife and I were kind of between shows this past weekend. Shows that I am going to talk about in upcoming episodes of this podcast that rhyme with Huffy the Clampire Slayer. Okay. We need a little break, a little palate cleanser, and we were looking through the streaming services like, hey, what should we watch? I didn't really want to start a whole nother series because I knew we still had a lot of stuff to get through on what we were already working our way through. And I found myself scrolling through Paramount Plus, and I was like, oh, all the Mission Impossibles are on here. And because Dead Reckoning Part 1 came out this summer, at least this summer as of recording this, I probably won't get to edit and release this for months, who knows. But I did want to see that. And my wife has told me repeatedly that the first Mission Impossible was one of her favorite movies. And as a side note, the reason I knew I loved her on our first date, aside from all of the more important cosmic, intangible reasons, was that, of course, you got to ask somebody on a first date what their favorite movie is. And her answer, without even a thought, without a blink, was The Matrix. And my response in my head was, marry me now? So between that and Mission Impossible, obviously she has really good taste in movies. And as another aside, anytime she recommends something to me, I'm sure I'll do an episode about this later, like my wife's immaculate recommendations or something, stuff that I had never seen. She has like again, immaculate track record. She has never recommended something to me that I have not liked. So that tells you something about our compatibility or fate or what have you. But anyway, she had told me that she only saw Mission Impossible 1 and 2, which I think was true for a lot of people, especially from our generation, that loved the first one, was kind of appalled by the second one, and just never gave the franchise a chance after that. I'm still hoping to take her to see Dead Reckoning before it's out of theaters, which looks like it's going to happen a lot sooner than anybody would have thought, which is really unfortunate. And that's something I'm sure I'll talk about later on in the episode. But we had talked earlier this summer, before that came out, of catching up with all the other Mission Impossible movies for her, seeing 4 through 6 for the first time, and for me, revisiting the whole franchise, because for my part, my little context and history with Mission Impossible is, from what I can remember, I only saw the first one sometime after it came out, like from running it at Blockbuster or something, and I remember generally liking it, but you know, I was in like maybe late middle school or early high school, and it was a little confusing, a little slow for my teenage tastes, but I remember generally liking it. And the second one, I think, if I remember correctly, I did see it in theaters or maybe right after, and really hating it and swearing off the franchise after that. Like I said, a lot of people probably did. So it never had like a special place in my heart or anything. But I was excited to see MI3 when it came out, because when I was in film school in the early 2000s, we had a big filing cabinet, because remember, this is back in the days, the not early days, but like the web 1.5 days, where a lot of stuff was available online, but it wasn't as centralized as it is now. There were all these random, you know, like really simple HTML sites that were like databases of screenplays, but a lot of them were like not formatted. They're in some HTML text format, or you could tell that somebody just like typed it up in Microsoft Word 98 or something. And, you know, it was hard to tell if it was even real. Part of being a screenwriting student, of course, was reading screenplays, and it was a little bit harder to get your hands on them than it is now. Even though, like I said, there were a lot of free copies available, they were questionable at best. And you had to do a lot of searching and a lot of digging to find something that wasn't like an early draft or something, or like an incomplete shooting draft. It was very inconsistent. But because of our professors' connections and stuff, we had a big file cabinet in our screenwriting department office that they would populate with authentic versions of screenplays. And one of them I remember reading for a writing for television class that I took, where we had to sort of study a show and a showrunner and then pitch an episode of that show as if we were the showrunner. So that was an interesting way to kind of like get a feel for that side of the industry. And I don't know if it was like I had to pick out of a hat or something, but for some reason I was assigned to watch and study Alias. So this was before MI3 came out, and had made a name for himself. J.J. Abrams had made a name for himself with Felicity, which I had never seen or maybe even heard about at that point. And Alias was currently airing. I think it was in its second season. And from what I saw of it, I did not like it. And no offense, but I've never been a Jennifer Gardner as an action or spy actress. I do think she's a great actress, and I really like her in a lot of movies like Juno. I think she's also really funny, and she pulls off comedy really well. But obviously, Elektra didn't work out, and I did not, at least when I in my pretentious college days, I didn't think Alias was very good. But I had to read the pilot of Alias, and I thought the script was incredible. I was floored by it. It was so tight, and there was so much going on, and it was so much tension. And at the time, I remember kind of being conflicted. I don't like this show, but I love this writer. So I just had the name J.J. Abrams in my head. And then, of course, a couple of years later, Lost came out, and I was, like a lot of people, I was totally a J.J. shill at the time, because Lost was the most amazing thing that, I had ever seen on television. So after college, when I heard that he was doing his first directorial debut with MI3, it wasn't oh, thank God they're bringing back Mission Impossible, but I was oh, I can't wait to see what this guy does with this material. So I'm pretty sure that I saw MI3 in the theater and really enjoyed it. But that was kind of the end of my experience with Mission Impossible, being on any kind of forefront of my interest or radar, because when they resurrected the franchise again several years later with Ghost Protocol, I was really not that interested, and I didn't make any effort to go see it. I think I saw it when it was out on Netflix a while later. So I've seen them all up to Dead Reckoning, which I hope to remedy again in theaters this summer, because I just know that it's the kind of movie that is made for the theaters. But again, since my wife had not seen anything past 2, and since I've only seen each one, as far as I remember, just once, and I have never gone back to revisit any of them, seeing them available all on Paramount Plus sparked a bit of a movie marathon for my wife and me yesterday. So we watched 1 through 3 in one sitting. I was pretty impressed, because I usually find it difficult to sit still for that long for any reason. And I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about all of it. I thought that I'd already formed my opinions on everything, and I didn't really have a lot to say. And I really don't have a ton to say, but I did have some thoughts, having revisited the first 3 movies out of the franchise again after so long. Because again, I've only seen each movie sometime closer to its release or on its original theatrical run, and I have not watched any of them again, except for maybe the first one, but that was decades ago when I was back in middle school or high school, so I don't have a clear memory of any of that. So this is going to be super involved, and is not going to be any kind of meticulous review or anything, but I thought it would be relevant timing to document my thoughts a little bit about this series, since it's all kind of coming full circle. So I'll start with 1 to 3, since I just watched those, and then I'll sit down at some point and do another recording when I watch 4 through 6. And then hopefully, whenever I can see Dead Reckoning in the theater or on digital release after in the coming months, I'll add that to the repertoire and then put this together as a singular episode and see how it all comes together. To get started, let's go back to the beginning. So for Mission Impossible 1, all I really remembered about it was the iconic shots and sequences that are referenced and constantly have been parodied, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, like Ethan dropping in to the CIA, the fish tank scene, that kind of stuff. And I do remember that Brian De Palma made it, so I was expecting And I remembered that there was, like a lot of his signature Dutch angles and unique editing. Obviously, the guy loved Battleship Potemkin, which is probably taught at every film school ever since Untouchables came out. But I've always respected him as a director, and I was excited to go back and revisit some of his work too, because I haven't seen anything from him for so long. And I gotta say, as a standalone film, it is really excellent, but it was surprisingly not what I remembered in terms of the genre. And I think that's not the film's fault. I think it's the franchise's fault. Because that one movie was more of a suspense thriller with just a little bit of explosive action at the end. And then after that point, it just became more of an action franchise, more akin to, like, I would say Fast and Furious, not as hokey and not as big and bombastic and totally illogical and in defiance of physics and everything. It's not completely in the superhero realm, except for the second one, but that's its own thing. But I know it gets compared a lot to, especially the second one, gets compared a lot to James Bond, and I definitely feel touches and influence of Bond kind of stuff. And Bond, too, became more action-oriented than spy-oriented as time went on. It's a funny thing, spy and espionage and more like thrillers in the non-horror realm, but more like in the political and socio-political realm of storytelling. Because I think a lot of times when we talk about thrillers, people immediately think of like horror thrillers or suspense thrillers. It's a really tough genre to write for. And I'll tell you my direct experience with that. In college, I think it was like my junior year, we did the 48-hour film festival, which if you don't know what I'm talking about, if you're listening to Moviecast, you most likely know what that is. But if you happen to not, go look it up, look at the Wikipedia article or something. The 48-hour film festival is where you get assigned a few different aspects of a story, like a prop, a line, a character name, and most importantly, a genre. And you have 48 hours to make a short film and submit it to this 48-hour film festival organization. And then you hope to get some kind of recognition. They do screenings and things. But some friends of mine in college were all film people, wanted to try our hand at it. And we got assigned the spy genre. And I remember, because I was one of the writers of the group, we were up all night just trying to figure out what that even means. Like, it's really tough, because most of the time people, when they think of the spy genre, at least on the more like mainstream macro level, we think of like James Bond and Mission Impossible. But even then, it's really difficult to discern exactly what makes something like a spy movie or story as opposed to like an action, adventure, thriller. Like, just having spies in it doesn't necessarily make it that genre. And I think that's been sort of a misnomer, as John Woo and then the others since him have taken over the franchise from De Palma. De Palma was the one that seemed to understand what a spy thriller really meant. Because what really stood out to me about watching it this time, with, again, only just like little flashes and iconic scenes and lines and stuff that having stood out to me from having seen it decades ago, was how the story was actually told. Because I think in different hands, they could have told the same story, but it could have been way more action heavy, and it could have been a lot bigger. It actually felt, interestingly to me, kind of more small scale, and that was because the focus was really on the tension and the psychology of the characters, as opposed to the bigger external conflict of the plot, which was definitely a big part of it. But for me, that's what really kind of distilled it down and made it more discernible as a spy movie, was the execution of how they told the story. And that came through all the choices that were made of how it was presented, like the acting, the music, the editing, the pacing, the aesthetics. Like if you compare MI1 to MI3, MI3 has that like desaturated, gritty style that I know was really popular at the time anyway. And like, you saw it everywhere in like Transformers and Terminator Salvation and even like Christopher Nolan movies. They were like really just sweaty and gritty and desaturated kind of feel, where Mission Impossible 1 was a lot more sleek and stylized in a different way. It's really hard to kind of articulate. But the biggest thing about it that really made it a spy suspense thriller to me was the fact that the majority of the movie was either planning or executing plans of theft and espionage and information gathering and that kind of stuff. It was all of the action was saved for the end, like the action, the physical person to person action. And there really wasn't a lot of fistfights. I know that Ethan doesn't, but I don't think in general there was like a gun fired in the whole movie, if I remember correctly. So what we generally think of as action is like car chases and shootouts and jumping out of buildings and all that kind of stuff. This movie didn't have any of that, but it didn't mean that it was slow, because it was gripping from beginning to end, and it didn't mean that it was like lacking things happening. It felt like the plot was always moving forward. The characters were always working towards a goal, and then having challenges and conflict along the way, and then having to, reassess and work around that. It never felt static. It never felt like they were spinning their wheels. It felt like time was never on their side. And some of it too, I think, there was a certain aloofness to all the characters, or maybe aloof isn't the right word, but a detachment. We were like sort of watching these people play out this situation, but I never felt like that we were super emotionally engaged in any of them. And in this case, that was actually really helpful, because it made us as an audience member almost feel mistrustful of everything that was going on. And you never quite sure, who was on the up and up and who was really the bad guy and who was out to get whom and everything like that. I don't think it was meant to be character driven on an emotional level as much as it was character driven on a characters, making choices to drive the plot kind of level. But when the action did happen, it was incredible. And, there's that whole law of diminishing returns. And the thing that we're seeing with action movies, I mean, it's been an issue forever, but especially in the past decade or so, where movies just feel constructed around action set pieces. And if you listen to this podcast at all, you may have heard my good friend Jason and me discuss this in episode 20, our theory that a lot of films are actually written that way, where they start with a series of action set pieces that they know they want to do, and then they just kind of fill in the blanks of the story in between that. That's why things often feel so disjointed and illogical and nonsensical and like non sequitur kind of storytelling, where it just jumps from thing to thing. It seems like De Palma and the writers really understood how to build up to and then have a huge climactic action scene that was so satisfying, because we didn't see anything like that for the runtime leading up to it. So it felt big and bombastic and climactic, instead of it just being, oh, it's another action scene. Some filmmakers are able to build on action and keep it going, and building up to everything kind of culminating in the ultimate action, which is why I think movies like Die Hard and Aliens and Terminator 2 are often touted as like, the best action movies ever, is because the filmmakers understood that, as opposed to like a lot of Marvel stuff and Fast and Furious and etc. franchises where you just get kind of numb to it after a while, because it's just the same level of intensity, where nothing's intense when everything's intense, and everything's big and everything's turned up to 10 or 11. That's what really stood out to me about this movie, was how awesome the action was, because it was really short and sweet and super, super suspenseful and intense. But the rest of the movie leading up to that was just tension building on tension. So by the time we got to that, it was such a release and so satisfying. That's what a good climax of a movie should be. I don't think the movie is like perfect by any means. I found the plot to be as followable as it was written to be, but I did find myself also like kind of talking it through with my wife a couple times during the movie. I would pause and be like, okay, so they did that and he said that, so that means blah, 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 right? Okay, good, we're on the okay, and then we would move on. But, so it took some processing, and I think that's great, like, to actually have to pay attention to a movie and not have it just be, like, background fodder. There is something to be said, of course, that, visual storytelling shouldn't have to have everything spoon-fed to you, and this movie definitely does not. But there were some times where the visual storytelling was hard to follow because there was all other stuff going on at the same time, especially that scene where Tom Cruise is sitting down with his boss that he had previously thought was dead, and he was smiling and agreeing with him with what he was saying on the surface, but then you were getting these flashes of what Ethan was really thinking, and that was a little unclear about, oh, is that what really happened? Is that what Ethan is thinking? In most movies they would kind of stop, and if they're going to do flashes like that, they would show you the recognition in the point of view of the character's face and stuff, but this was like he was contradicting what he was thinking, but with how he was interacting, which was really clever, really well written, and really well executed. But it was a little confusing, and it was supposed to be. But I think some of that stuff might have been a little bit more clear on paper, and it was a bit harder to film and edit in a clear way. But I don't think that's a detriment. I just think that that's what made this a really good spy movie. I think every production team after that really either struggled with or just didn't want to bother with trying to tell a good spy suspense movie, and instead just went for an action movie with spies in it. So that gets me on to number 2. It was fun seeing the first 3 all together because, at the time they came out years and years apart. So it might have been actually easier for some audiences to digest Mission Impossible 2 because maybe they hadn't seen number 1 a long time, or some people probably hadn't seen it at all. But it was a real head spinner and like culture shock to go from the first one, and then some of the first stuff that we see in the second one is like these big sweeping wide shots of Ethan like rock climbing, and it felt more like a XXX movie or something, like action sports, which, yes, I noticed it did come into play later because he was scaling the side of a slippery cliff face. But so much of how the first one was framed was really claustrophobic. There was so many close-ups and close-up Dutch angles, and the times that we got wides were really quick. So that was the thing that stood out to me like immediately with the second one, was that it was just visually told very differently. And of course, they were toying around with and Tom Cruise was toying around with this character of Ethan Hunt, because the first movie didn't fully develop him. He was as developed as he needed to be for the story to play out, but we didn't get to know too much about him. And now all of a sudden he's like this wisecracking, suave, swarmy playboy kind of. Obviously they're going for more of like a James Bond kind of thing. But going into the second movie, again, the things that I remember the most about it were just some of the big iconic shots and scenes, like the rock climbing and the motorcycle bro hug in the air and the knife to the eye and stuff like that. I remember that stuff vaguely, but I really didn't remember anything about the plot. And I especially didn't remember how different Ethan was. It really did feel like a completely different franchise, and it was, and they were trying out and experimenting, and I think that's really cool in a way, kind of like they did with Harry Potter too, where they brought in different directors at first and they were experimenting, trying out things. But there is something to be said about when you're telling stories inside of a closed universe, it's not like a multiverse or something, and you take wild risks and swings, which I am all about taking big risks and swings when it comes to storytelling and film. But when they're supposed to be direct sequels to each other and they're so vastly different, and the directors and the writers have vastly different and sometimes conflicting and contradicting visions about what it's supposed to be, that can be a little frustrating as an audience member. That's why I am really starting to yearn for the days of standalone movies and storytelling as opposed to everything having to be connected in the franchises, but even like just multiple sequels. Because at least like Mission Impossible hasn't branched off to like have, you know, a Benji's solo movie or whatever. You know, they're not trying to make an interconnected universe yet. I'm sure they're talking about it. But either way, consistency is good. But on the same token, though, too, I would say that, like, you know, David Yates doing all the Harry Potter stuff and Fantastic Beasts stuff since Order of the Phoenix, I think was his first one. It's gotten a little stale and redundant, a lot stale and redundant and old. And they really do need some fresh blood to, you know, shake things up and make things new. But I also think that's where television is sort of the answer to that, because television is more long form, even if it's not serialized. Now, having seen a lot of Buffy, because my brother's been bugging me for years, having watched almost all of X-Files, because that's one of my wife's favorite shows, those exist in the same universe, but the episodes are so short, and it's so much easier to have like one-off kind of things in that format. I just think when you're going in on like big budget franchise or sequel stuff, to take these big wild swings in different contradictory directions can be a little misguided, because, you know, what we're all there for really when it comes down to it is to watch a story play out on screen. And if the story is supposed to exist in the same universe, but it just doesn't feel like it, I don't know, it just takes me out of the experience, and it makes me look behind the curtain and, I don't know, not feel as attached to the material. A perfect example of this too is Star Wars. I know that we live in this time, and I've mentioned this many times, so I won't belabor it, but we live in this era where where everybody's trying to say that the prequels were actually good, or like underneath all the crap, there's a lot of good stuff. But the biggest issue to me that still is glaring is that they don't feel like they fit into the universe. They look and feel completely different than the OG trilogy. And now that, you know, they've tried to go back and remedy that in some ways by like doing Rogue One, and Andor was very much in the, you know, the more like retro tech realm of the 70s and 80s feel that they had. But the prequels were just like, they were too light and glossy and cartoony, and the technology was way better like 30 years before the original trilogy was supposed to take place. And I understand that Lucas had access to better technology, and yeah, he wanted to make things, he would have made it that way if he could have originally, blah blah blah. But it doesn't really matter, because your finished product had a certain look and feel, and then decades later you revisit that universe, but you decide to just kind of change it all because you want to. It still doesn't sit right with me. I can't watch the prequels anyway, because they're just god awful. I don't care what the revision history has to say about it. And the way that things feel aesthetically is not the only thing that makes, you know, a movie worth watching or a good story worth telling. But it's all part of the verisimilitude, a word I just love saying, the narrative reality and truth of a story. When you break that verisimilitude, even if it's in a sequel or a franchise installment down the line or something, to me, it affects the quality of that story. That's why the one thing that I'll say about the Hobbit movies, even though there was a lot of experimentation and a lot more CGI and things, in general, as much as those movies bothered me in the same storytelling issues that the prequels had, and the indulgence and the nonsense and the wasted time and all the unnecessary stuff, at least the Hobbit movies felt like they existed in the same freaking universe as Lord of the Rings. So as much as I never want to see those movies again, I really do at least don't feel completely insulted by the fact that they were made by the same production team but feel like completely different universe movies. To me, that's one reason that like Harry Potter, I don't really feel like the universe really started until the third one, even though there was big changes made after that. At least it all kind of felt more consistent after Cuarón came in and made things feel a little bit less daytime TV ish. Sorry, Christopher Columbus, but I just don't like your direction in those movies. But anyway, I'm getting way off track here. But hopefully I've illustrated this point way more than necessary, that MI2, my biggest issue with it is not the movie itself, but the franchise that it's in. It was just the wrong movie in the wrong franchise. Should have just been another standalone John Woo movie. And it's incredible to me that they let him get away with so much like kung fu, martial art, film stylized kind of stuff with all the zooms and the music cues and things that were just like really, really hokey. I understand why they're contextually used in kung fu movies, and I love kung fu movies. I mean, Bruce Lee is one of my favorite martial artists and film stars of all time, and I grew up, in a martial arts oriented family, and I always have a huge place in my heart for that kind of stuff, but it just didn't work for a Mission Impossible. And I mean, all this stuff has been talked to death, so I'm not going to get into all the little things when it comes to what didn't work about this movie. But my point is that watching this again after all this time, I actually generally enjoyed the movie. I thought it was okay. It had a lot of wasted time in the first hour, and I was pretty frustrated with just how thin the story was for how long the running time was. I mean, I really think it could have been a tight hour and a half movie, or there could have been more going on and more stakes, because it actually felt pretty small scale, even though there was big stakes when it came down to, the overall plot of like this virus being unleashed. But it was really a very small cast and small scale kind of events happening with them. And so all the time that they took to kind of like get the plot going was a little frustrating. And I think that's just, a script and an editing issue. For some reason, I had it in my head that the second one was way more convoluted and confusing than the first one. And it was really not the case. Having watched it again, it was really easy to follow and sometimes a little surprisingly simplistic, because, even though there were a couple twists with who was wearing a mask and stuff, it was really just like the same few characters kind of manipulating each other for most of the movie, and until it all just came down to like a big brawl at the end. And I think if it had all come to a little bit more of like a heady and intellectual level of sort of spy game playing, especially because the two main characters, or the main character and his antagonist, were both agents, you'd think that there would be a little bit more mind games and manipulation and stuff going on. But in the end, it was really just like, I want this thing, you have that thing, I have this thing, let's fight. And so that's what it felt more like, a superhero movie or just a regular action movie in that regard. And I think that's what it failed at the most, was not what it actually was. It was a totally passable, mostly enjoyable, kind of throwaway popcorn action movie. And I mean, I've always enjoyed John Woo's stuff just as much as I enjoy a lot of his ilk. I mean, Face Off is one of my favorite movies ever. But the problem was that it was branded Mission Impossible, and the first movie was so different. Maybe one thing is that they just didn't think they could recreate what they did, so they tried something wildly different. But none of it felt consistent with the first one. It felt like a total departure, like a completely different reality. And that's why it just didn't work as a Mission Impossible movie. But I honestly did enjoy it. And I thought that fight at the end was pretty brutal. It was a pretty just knockdown, drag-out brawl interspersed with some really, really impractical like spin kicks. But in the end, and I said it constantly throughout the movie, what it was worth was how cool things looked. John Woo knows how to make stuff look cool, no matter if it makes sense or is practical. Like jumping out of a building with like a gun in each hand, pulling wheelies on your motorcycle while you're wearing a leather jacket and sunglasses, even though you're a spy that's supposed to be like covert and saving the world, but you're doing that risky nonsense. Or like you're supposed to be recruiting this woman and yet you're like having a completely erratic and unnecessarily dangerous like car chase / demolition derby with her on the edge of a cliff. But regardless, all that stuff looked really freaking cool. So I at least got to give it that. And then MI3, honestly, seeing it again after all this time, and now having J.J. Abrams' career after that, in hindsight, it was a pretty damn good movie. One thing J.J. has always done a pretty good job of is getting you invested in his characters. He's never very deep. He doesn't take things to super layered and subversive levels or anything when it comes to the psychology and emotionality behind everything, but he does do a good job of making his characters like relatable and interesting enough that you are emotionally attached to them and you don't want to see them fail. And so he knows how to build his action around that. What I think was interesting about what he did, though, coming out of number 2, was that you would think, and you see this a lot in more modern franchises where they try to course correct. I mean, DC has been struggling with this for a decade, but you would think that after the critical backlash of the second one, that obviously like affected the franchise because they didn't put out another movie for what, like 6 years, even though it was only 4 years in between the first two. They were obviously trying to figure out what they were going to do. And I'm surprised that they didn't go back to De Palma or something like that and say, okay, we need to get this back on a more spy suspense track. They obviously wanted to stick with the action. And it's interesting too that JJ had done a spy action series. So, you know, he knew how to do some of that stuff, but it really leaned in more to the action side, but it took itself more seriously and felt more in universe, even with all the gunfights and explosions and missile launchers and jumping off of buildings and stuff. It did feel more grounded and quote unquote realistic than the second one. So it did, to me, it did feel like a natural kind of progression from the first one, more or less. I did buy it as an authentic sequel, whereas the second one feels like this other world kind of thing. But I do find it interesting though that they didn't try to tone down the action. They still wanted to go with the action. Maybe some of that was because of the zeitgeist, where what was going on with action movies at the time. I know this was around the time that like Transformers was coming out and stuff, so maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know, to compete in the marketplace or something. But and Bond had found a lot of success with the Daniel Craig era of being mostly action oriented rather than spy and suspense oriented. So maybe that has something to do with it too. But when comparing the first and the third, like leaving the second out of it, it still does feel like too much action, too much gunfire, too many explosions and that kind of stuff, just when you're comparing those two as a sequel to the other. But still, the movie itself was presented in a more consistent context to the first one than the second one was. So I'll give it that. And knowing J.J. Abrams now as a director and all of his indulgences and things that he tends to rely on, like fast-paced editing, fast-paced dialogue and talking and quips and lens flare and all that kind of stuff, I was expecting a lot more of that from MI3, but I was pleasantly surprised that it was really, really kind of on the level and toned down. I don't know if that was just because he was still getting his feel for his cinematic director sensibilities, or if maybe the studio mandated him to not indulge all of his whims. But either way, I found it to be like a much more immersive experience than the second one. Didn't take me out of it constantly with all the weird editing and camera choices and acting choices and all that kind of stuff. So as a standalone movie, I think it was like pretty great, actually. I was really compelled, especially in the second half when things got personal. And, you just really wanted to see Tom Cruise succeed and wanted to see him overcome not just Philip Seymour Hoffman, but who was really kind of pulling the strings and putting him into the situation of all this stuff. And the action itself was really grounded and suspenseful and tangible. It was really hard hitting. Like when Ethan jumped out of a window in a skyscraper in the second one, it was like, you thought he was just going to fly away because he was like a superhero. But in the third one, when he was going to do that swing onto the next building, he was scared and everybody was scared for him. And you really felt like he could fail. So definitely it was more grounded in like a humanism and wasn't all about like just the cool looking aesthetics. And I really appreciated that. So it made the action more gritty and believable and exciting. But now having seen these three again for the first time in a very long time and seeing them together, what I'll say with this batch, because I really do think that the first three were a series of experiments, and then the next 3 or 4, because it sounds like Dead Reckoning is kind of in the same realm, they kind of had found their footing by the time they got to Ghost Protocol. They knew what they wanted it to be. They knew what kind of spectacle they were going for and what kind of tone, and it's been like that, even though they toyed around with it a little bit. But these first 3 were like, hey, let's resurrect this old TV show, and put a more modern spin on it. And that was the first one. And the second one was like, well, the first one was successful, but let's try something wildly different and just see how it goes. And that was the second one. And the third one was like, all right, we got to bring this back down to reality a little bit, but we still want it to be like, more action oriented. So that was like the third one. So I feel like these do kind of come together as this weird little contradictory package, and then it's several years later. What was it, 2006 to 2011, I think was when Ghost Protocol came out. So there's another big gap. And then ever since Ghost Protocol, they've been putting them out more consistently. So it feels like they've had more of a plan, and Tom Cruise and Chris McQuarrie and like the producers really kind of know what they're going for at this point. So I'm going to watch those now with the wife, and I'll report back about that batch. And then hopefully see Dead Reckoning Part 1. And then we'll see what happens with this writer's strike and actor's strike. But hopefully Dead Reckoning Part 2 comes out the next year or so. And we'll see how this whole thing goes. But what I really want to say about this first batch in the end is I think the most rewatchable one, and the one that I was most like impacted by, and the one that I'm going to want to seek out again because just of the filmmaking and the vision, the writing, and all the things that made it great and the things that made it rewatchable is the first one. I didn't appreciate how great that movie is seeing it as a teen. And I didn't appreciate a lot of movies for that reason, for being that age and not having, more refined appreciation for the finer things. But I think the first one is up there with like one of the best blockbusters ever made. And I really, really can't wait to watch it and continue to like analyze and break down and distill why it's so good, because that's why I have this podcast, and that's why I have the brain that I do. And that's why I went to film school in the first place, even though I didn't go into that as a career. I just love the craft of film, and I love understanding why it works. All right, so I watched Mission Impossible 4 Ghost Protocol last night, and a few thoughts on that one. The thing that I overall appreciated the most about it was that Brad Bird understood, it seemed, what made the series great at the get-go, which was the building of suspense and intrigue and tension. And I noticed that this movie didn't have any major shootouts. And it really did take its time to kind of develop the plot and immerse you on what was going on. It really did feel like a natural sequel to the first one more than the other two, just in terms of tone and presentation. It was a little bit more patient with its style. It was a little bit more sleek. There were nice cross dissolves. So you could tell that Brad Bird was conscious and aware of what makes a good Mission Impossible movie, but still keeping it feeling kind of contemporary and modern, which in one way, you know, he brought in, or he exploited the Simon Pegg character for humor a little bit more, which I see as kind of a double-edged sword. It is good to have humor to offset the tension. In this one especially, Ethan Hunt was so consistently serious and kind of dour, which was fine. I totally get it. Like, he was dealing, you know, he was in a post-marriage, back in the field, which I don't think we were supposed to get the impression that he was super stoked on. So you had to lighten the mood a little bit. But Simon Pegg, as much as I love like Edgar Wright stuff with him, and I think he's generally pretty funny, sometimes a little bit goes a long way. And when it's just Simon Pegg kind of being Simon Pegg in the middle of a serious scene, you're like, all right, we get it. You're the comic relief guy. Okay, you know, you always have something kind of bewildered or some non sequitur to say. It wasn't overdone, but I didn't think it was necessary to have him be that much. It was kind of like the way that a little bit of humor came out of Gimli in the first Lord of the Rings, and then they just compounded on it and diminished those returns with the other two movies. Too much of a good thing, you know? Just like the way that Simon Pegg was a bit role for the third movie, and he was funny for the couple scenes that he was in. And then in this movie, he was that, but just the whole time. Still, though, I appreciate that Brad Bird is a more consistent and aware writer than somebody like, I don't know, Taika Waititi, that just cannot seem to hold back at all and just makes everything a farce. Brad Bird knew how to put in humor, but without sacrificing the tension too much. A couple times it was a little much. But even though I generally appreciate and enjoyed the little bit more restrained and patient execution of this movie as opposed to number 3, it definitely felt a little slow to me. Not boring necessarily. I wasn't ever like bored and just wanting things to happen, but it did feel like the tension wasn't like the first film just does such a great job of hitting you really, really hard with the plot catalyst, you know, right at the beginning. And then the tension just builds from there. The sense of dread, the sense of suspense builds and builds and builds and builds on itself. Whereas in this movie, there was really big, you know, world-ending stakes, but there was a lot of time just kind of chilling, or a lot of time preparing, or a lot of establishing shots. And it just felt it felt like the editing could have been a little bit tighter. I don't think it was the script or the story as much as the editing. Could have been a little bit more punchy, but they definitely kind of got that in the future movies, which move at like a breakneck pace. But otherwise, I thought the movie was like astounding in terms of the stunts and the action. Obviously, this is the one where they really, or like Tom Cruise or whoever's, I don't know if it was a totally like conscious choice on anybody's part, or if it just kind of evolved out of the nature of the series, when Tom Cruise started like going to extreme lengths to do crazy stunts that would be a big sensation and marketing talking points going into getting people to go on opening weekend and stuff. But not only scaling that building in Dubai, but then like running down it. Those are really nail biting and impressive stunts. I don't think I realized, even though I knew it was going to happen, that I was holding my breath that whole time that he was scaling the side of the building. And the sandstorm chase is really cool and unique. It's funny, like a lot of times we complain about Marvel and DC movies, especially DC, ending in a big climax of like dust and grit where you can't see anything and like there's no sense of space or landscape or anything. But this is a great way to do that right because it was so claustrophobic and you really felt Ethan's sense of like urgency and frustration at being shrouded by the sandstorm where, you know, he's used to chasing people where he can see them. I thought that was really clever and creative. And the action scenes built on themselves really well. It was nice that the action scenes were parsed out a little bit. I think maybe that was a thing that held back number 3 a little bit, was that not just that it was so action oriented, but that it was also jammed in together that there wasn't ever a chance to breathe. But in this one, it was nice that it balanced the plot and plot developments with action, so there would be some downtime, which I know I was just kind of complaining about, but I don't mind that because the first movie doesn't have any real action until the end. But even though the tension wasn't as heightened in this one because of the editing, in my opinion, the action was still really well built up to, because you knew what was at stake going into these scenes. And then when things would go wrong, that really built the tension and the suspense of like what was going to happen. And even when you thought it was over, it just kept going. And I thought they were really creatively not just like directed and executed, but also staged, like how they played out and how there was this like constant kind of cause and effect, especially during the sandstorm one and that final really creative and crazy fist fight in that automated car garage vending machine thing. That was really cool. All right, in the past couple days, I've watched Rogue Nation and Fallout. So that means in the past, I don't know, week and a half, I think it's been, I've watched all 6 Mission Impossibles with my wife on Paramount Plus. So we're all caught up. And if all goes well, later tonight, as of recording this, we're going to go see Dead Reckoning Part 1. Well, it's still in the theaters, and it'll be the first one that I've seen in the theaters since probably 2 or 3. Can't remember which one of those, if either, I did see in the theaters, but I'm pretty sure I saw one of them. So I think I said the other day when I saw Ghost Protocol that was the closest to the first, just in terms of tone and style. But now having seen Rogue Nation, I can definitely say, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that Rogue Nation feels like, to me, the closest brethren to the first Mission Impossible than any of the other sequels in between. Chris McQuarrie, even though he's a very different director in a lot of ways than Brian De Palma, he really seemed to understand the essence of what made De Palma's film work so well, but also why the franchise was able to sustain after that movie. He really brought together with Rogue Nation, even though I think Brad Bird did a really good job of taking what worked from the first one and then the sequels and kind of integrating the suspense with the action. McQuarrie took it to a more mature and slicker, but also a little bit more grounded and gritty level, while still maintaining like the general tone and style that De Palma first kind of brought when he rebooted the franchise. So I really, really, really enjoyed Rogue Nation, and I remember liking it a lot the first time I saw it. And this one especially, though all of the movies really benefited from a second watch for me. But this one really paid attention to how it was constructed, how McQuarrie wrote the scenes and then executed them. I don't know, there was something there that was missing from the second, third, and fourth. There was a certain awareness and balance to everything that was going on. And this is the first one, too, where most of the cast that was introduced or expanded upon in Ghost Protocol was carried over and given even more room to breathe and develop in this one with like Benji, Luther, of course, but also Jeremy Renner's character. And that's why even though Brad Bird and McQuarrie's movies are definitely distinct from each other in a lot of ways, and we'll see what happens with Dead Reckoning when I see it later. But for now, I feel like 4 through 6 really do create a nice little continuity and companionship that the first 3 don't share, partially because of the plot through lines and threads that are established early on in like 4th and 5th one and continue on, and the characters. But it almost feels like Ghost Protocol was sort of a warm-up, and McQuarrie sort of perfected where the franchise was going. I love the addition of Rebecca Ferguson's character. She is up there to me. Now, having seen these again, I would definitely put her up there with some of my childhood hero characters, which for a lot of people in my generation, I'm sure it's true, but Sigourney Weaver's Ellen Ripley in Aliens, Linda Hamilton's Sarah Connor in Terminator, and then more recently, Emily Blunt's character in Edge of Tomorrow, which I didn't realize at the time, but that was written by Christopher McQuarrie, so that makes sense. But the guy really has a way with writing female characters like Emily Blunt and Rebecca Ferguson to be like Ripley and Sarah Connor before them, like total badasses, but also relatable and flawed and imperfect, and to be both foils and foiled by other characters, to be part of a team, to be part of a collaborative process to find success of their goals. That's why she was such a fun character, and all of these characters really, because even though, you know, the good guys are going to win, there's still a lot of tension around the action scenes and things, even with all of the like horrific motorcycle crashes and car chases and car crashes and falling off of stuff and hand-to-hand fights where they get totally annihilated, but then they just kind of get up and keep limping on. It stretches believability, but in context, in verisimilitude of its universe, that stuff doesn't take me out of the movie. But even with all that, just knowing that none of these characters are superheroes, that when they get hurt, they get hurt. When they get captured, they don't always have a way out. And Rebecca Ferguson's character is a perfect example of that. We know that she's highly trained and very capable, but she has to find a lot of grit and perseverance, and she has to be creative about all the challenges that she faces in these movies, because a lot of her components are men and they're bigger than her and they're armed. So there's tension around that. Like, I love how similar she was in a lot of ways to Black Widow, especially with her fighting style, which she would use her legs as an asset to pull like jits moves or get her legs around people's necks. But unlike Black Widow, it didn't always work. It wasn't like this constant display of like, look how cool I look. Everything that she did in a fight looked cool, but it was also practical, and you weren't always sure if she was going to be able to pull it off. And you could tell as a character, she wasn't always self-assured about that too. Another way that I think McQuarrie seemed to really understand what made a good Mission Impossible movie was that even though there was a lot of action, there really wasn't a lot of gunfights and showdowns and shootouts. The action seemed natural for what was going on in the spy thriller world that these characters were existing in and reacting to. It didn't rely on that same old kind of tired gunfire action movie trope. Another thing I really appreciated about Rogue Nation was not just its pacing, which was phenomenal. I was gripped the whole time. It never felt slow. It never really slowed down, but it wasn't going at a breakneck like whiplash speed like the third one was. But also the structure. I thought it was really interesting how it sort of circumvented, to some degree, subverted what usually happens in action movies of this caliber and this scale, where it just tried to kind of up the ante every time there was a big action spectacle. Part of that was when there was hand-to-hand combat. It was not only choreographed, but shot in a way to keep it not always feeling just kind of repetitive, like people exchanging punches. Just like in a good martial arts movie, there was an ebb and flow. There was a story being told, a power play to all the fights, but also the chase sequences. It never really felt like it was spinning its wheels or was redundant. That was a big issue with the second one, even though that one was constructed to be more like a martial arts film than an American action film. It didn't have the dynamicism of scenes or sequences like Christopher McQuarrie really seemed to understand. Is you're always like moving towards something, and when there's a setback, it's an actual setback, not just like, oh, I got punched now, so now I punch you back. And then we just go like that for a while. It really seemed that McQuarrie was always had story as his first priority, not aesthetics, even though the aesthetics were amazing. The cinematography, this one, more than any of them up till this point, really felt more James Bondish in terms of its like scope and scale, and just so many wonderful wides, and the depth of frame was like just kind of jaw-dropping. Because when you needed like a big open environment, he was able to deliver that in a real awe-inspiring kind of way. But then when things needed to feel claustrophobic and tense and tight, I just really feel like we haven't seen that caliber of filmmaking since De Palma when it comes to this franchise. But anyway, as I was saying about the structure of it, there were more than enough killer, badass, really spectacle-oriented, mind-blowing action scenes that I remember by like the low point going into the third act. Because remember, I haven't seen this one in years since it first came out. And most likely I watch it on an iPad on a bus back then because I was traveling a lot for work back then. By that point in the movie, I was like just expecting that whatever the major climactic scene was going to be, that there's no way that they could sustain the momentum and the tension and scope and the stakes of everything that's come before, which is what a lot of action movies suffer from, is that third act. By the time you get to the big blowout action scene, you've already had so many. And I'll talk more about this when I talk about Fallout too. But I do think that this movie was a perfect setup for how Fallout was executed. It seemed like they really had planned ahead for this. But I thought it was really clever how there was some action and there was a good tense chase and some hand-to-hand combat. It really seemed like they were aware of the fact that by that point in the movie, there was no way that they were going to match what they had already done on an action scale. So instead, they made it way more character and plot climactic and satisfying and full circle when you realize how the whole sequence was meant to lure Lane into a glass box so he could be gassed, just like he did to Tom Cruise at the beginning. It was so clever and pulled off so well that I realized like I didn't need a big action scene to top what's come before. I just needed a satisfying conclusion to the story, and it paid off tenfold with how they brought everything back around together. That's almost like a character in and of itself in this franchise at this point, is like how many misdirections, how unique and clever and subversive can they be about bringing everything together. I think of all the movies, at least that I've seen so far, this one was the best in that regard. And that's why, again, I think this one really pairs well with the first one in terms of tone, but also execution. Because not only did it really prioritize suspense, which made it feel more like a spy movie, like I talked about earlier, than any of the other movies, because they had those elements, but they really were more about the action. This one had copious amounts of really big bombastic action, but none of that was in place of or forced the spy suspense stuff to be sacrificed. So going into Fallout, I had the biggest reservations about this one, aside from number 2, because again, I only saw it the one time after it came out. I remember hearing a lot of hype about it. People calling it like one of the best action movies of the decade, of the century, of all time. But again, I watched it at home. I probably got it on Redbox or something. I don't think I had a chance to watch it all at once, if I remember correctly. So I watched it in increments over a couple days, which is common for me because a lot of times life doesn't allow me to just sit down and dedicate any amount of time or concentration to something. So there was that, but there was also the fact that I'd only seen each movie for the most part once and closer to their release. So there was a big gap in between having seen each movie. So not only was I not like super current on what had happened in the previous films, but I just really wasn't in my own kind of hype machine about it. But the other big thing that was going on during this time, because remember, this one came out in 2018 and Ghost Protocol had come out, 2011? This is when Marvel and the Avengers were ruling the box office and churning out multiple installments a year, and pre-Endgame, so like a lot of people, I was still on board with that. But that's a lot of superhero action. And then the Fast and Furious franchise was also at its peak. Maybe not peak quality, but definitely peak box office. And really, I think in general, if we look back now, the 2010s were like the peak franchise years. That's when a lot of big franchises were making the most money, like Jurassic Park or World and Fast and Furious and Marvel and all that stuff. And not only that, but they were mostly action oriented. So for me, at least, I really think there was a bit of homogenization and a law of diminishing returns in full effect by the time we got to the late 2010s in terms of action movies, because there were so many and there was so much spectacle that I think I was just getting a little burnt out on it. I was generally entertained by the big franchise blockbuster stuff that I was watching that was being released during that decade. But from what I can recall, nothing really blew my mind quite the way that the Avengers did in 2012, just because that was such a novelty. The novelty had worn off at that point. The only thing that even came close was Edge of Tomorrow, which I've talked about before in this show. And again, now knowing that it was written by McQuarrie just adds a new level of appreciation for me. But yeah, it wasn't that when I watched Fallout that I didn't like it or enjoy it necessarily. I do remember feeling, though, that it was so full of action cliches that I just was really kind of disengaged. Like running across rooftops where Tom Cruise famously, broke his foot, and flying helicopters and fighting in bathrooms. Like, I was like, oh, come on. Now they're just trying to top True Lies, which was like the best bathroom fight scene since Bad Boys. And then at the end, having not only yet another ticking clock on a digital readout, but having two, and having to defuse a nuclear bomb. At the time, I was just over it. I was like, yes, this is really well done on the surface, but I just felt like the screenplay was so trite, full of cliches and contrivances, that I just kind of wrote it off as like, oh, Mission Impossible has gone back to just generic action movie genre, like, and lost its way, just like after the first one. But now, having watched all of them from the beginning in a short amount of time, and especially watching Protocol, Rogue Nation, and then Fallout like back to back to back, I really see what I missed the first time. First of all of the Mission Impossible movies were full of action and spy cliches. And what I wasn't giving it credit for is that that's what makes it Mission Impossible. That's what it started as. I've never seen the original show, but I know enough through cultural zeitgeist and cultural osmosis that that's what it was. It was meant to be like a recognizable spy show. Like, it wasn't meant to subvert spy expectations and be something else. So of course you're going to be dealing with like world-ending events and megalomaniacal, mustache twirling, like supervillain, evil intellectuals. You're going to be dealing with bombs and ticking clocks and double crosses and triple crosses and double, triple agents and questioning allegiances and lots of technical gobbledygook and jargon and blueprints, and I could go on and on and on. Watching all these movies again really helped me appreciate the genre that they started operating in, and when they tried to go outside of that, how they kind of lost their personality, and how Chris McQuarrie really understood that, and Brad Bird for sure. And they brought that back and made Mission Impossible like the best version of itself in context of the time that it was made. Because the first one, as good as it is very much a product of the 90s. Even though I think it still holds up really, really well in general. I think it is kind of a timeless story and movie in that regard. I think it's something that we'll be able to watch decades into the future and still appreciate it for what it is outside of the time that it was made. But I really think that you can't quite say the same thing about 2 and 3, and 4 is kind of on the fence about that. I think it's walks a fine line between a little 2000s, especially with the almost sometimes Marvel level of quippy, bantery dialogue. That's what took me out of it the most. But Rogue Nation and Fallout, just felt like Mission Impossible movies to me. They were distinct from all that other stuff I was talking about, like the Daniel Craig era James Bond and Fast and Furious especially. I think that's what was going on for me at the time. I was watching all this stuff all around the same time, and there were so many dimly lit corridors and car chases and gunfights and double crosses and ticking time bombs and mustache twirling hackery villains that it made it hard for me at the time to see Fallout for what it really was, which was all of those things, but done better and done right. And I loved how this was not a necessarily direct sequel to Rogue Nation. It wasn't Rogue Nation Part 2, but it was a continuation of that story and those characters. I really think that Chris McQuarrie was really smart to take what Brad Bird had set up, because again, it really did feel like MI 1, 2, and 3 and 4 were all kind of restarts, but then from 4 on, there was a little bit more continuity and flow, and that just really helped make Fallout not feel just like the next inevitable installment of the franchise, but a completely justified continuation of the story. There was more story to tell with these characters, and the title says it all. It's the fallout of what the concluded but not finished, if that makes sense, story of Rogue Nation was. So yeah, this time around, the cliches, even the gunfights and the ticking time bomb and the having to defuse the bomb and cut the wires and everything, it didn't bother me to take me out of the experience. It actually bolstered it and made it more exciting because I was really swept up in the world. And maybe that's watching all these in a small time frame was really helpful, and I was really immersed in the world, and I was already kind of predisposed to be prepared for all those tropes because all the other movies had a lot of them. But also just on a writing level, everything was set up and led to logical places. Maybe I wasn't paying close enough attention when I first watched it, but I remember the whole diffusing the bomb thing at the end felt thrown into me at the time, but that's not the case at all. The groundwork was laid for it throughout the whole movie. But in contrast to Rogue Nation, what I think makes this a wonderful continuation and companion to Rogue Nation is that it did its own thing. It continued Rogue Nation, but it didn't feel redundant or repetitive because it had its own structure and its own sort of priority focus, which, like I said, Rogue Nation felt more like it was prioritizing its spy elements. Fallout was all about the action. And after watching such a great spy movie with Rogue Nation, I was totally primed for some bigger and more diverse action, I guess. So there were gunfights and car chases and motorcycles, but then by the climactic action scene, what I really didn't appreciate the first time around was how well they paired the hugely over the top and insane action of the helicopter chase and then the cliff edge fight and everything with the more grounded suspense of the ticking time bomb and diffusing it, but how it was all tied together and how the stakes were so big. I'm struggling right now to think of another action scene from the 2010s that had that level of sophistication to it. Not to mention the stunts and the effects and the cinematography and the scope and the scale and just the beautiful scenery and everything, in contrast to the gritty and then almost grotesque, by the time that Henry Cavill had his two-faced face going on and everything. It was also visually stunning. Wow. I can't wait to see Christopher McQuarrie go back outside of this Mission Impossible franchise and do some other stuff, because I just really did not appreciate him as a distinct visionary director like I do now. I need to go back and watch some of his stuff again. Like, I remember having seen Way of the Gun in college and was bored to tears by it. But again, I only saw it that one time almost 20 years ago, so my perspective, I'm sure, will be very different. Another thing that I just really appreciated about McQuarrie and his production team and how they not just wrote, but worked with the actors on both Fallout and Rogue Nation, and we'll see how Dead Reckoning is. But again, because these were being released at the same time as all the Marvel and Fast and Furious, etc. stuff, I was really impressed how much restraint there was put on the tension-breaking humor and levity that is so prevalent, and everybody talks about it now, but it still doesn't seem like it's changing the writing or directing of these big budget movies, because still emotional beats, tense suspense, action, it's all being undercut constantly by humor at inappropriate times, and really takes you out of the experience, and a lot of times isn't natural to the characters doing it. Like, I know everybody loves Thor Ragnarok and was somehow surprised that Love and Thunder wasn't as good, even though they were both by Taika Waititi. Now, I haven't seen Love and Thunder, and I'm not going to, but I enjoy Ragnarok, but I don't think it was some kind of masterpiece. And a big part of that was because none of those characters felt like the characters that had been established previously, because so much of it was played for comedy, which is fine in and of itself. But when you are part of these bigger franchises, it is really weird going from like Avengers or even Thor 2 to Ragnarok, where Thor is acting like a different person, as a totally different character, because everything's got to be a joke. And I shouldn't have to say this, but it's not that I don't like comedy. One of my all-time favorite movies is a comedy, Tommy Boy. But I think one of the most overplayed genre pairings is action comedy, because both things are just so heightened that if they're not balanced well, which they're usually not, neither of them really have room to breathe and to be fully what they are. A lot of times you have people in the middle of a gunfight, like, I don't know, Central Intelligence comes to mind, or even Rush Hour or something, where the chemistry between the actors is great, or Jumanji, or really like any rock action comedy. You always have this great chemistry between characters. You most often have like really good plot setups and situations for the characters to react to each other in. But they're usually so devoid of tension because they're like cracking jokes and arguing and quipping with each other in the middle of like serious violent gun battles and martial arts scenes and stuff. I'm not saying it can't work, but I'm saying Christopher McQuarrie really seemed to understand that. And I think that's the one thing that Brad Bird struggled with. It worked much better in animation, in my opinion. And if you go back and watch like Iron Giant, he really let his emotional beats stand alone. It was very funny, but the action and the drama was not undercut by the humor. The humor was added as a layer of dynamicism to the heavier stuff. They weren't always skipping along hand in hand. I think the worst contender of this is Marvel, and has been since Joss Whedon. I mean, I love the first Avengers movie for what it is, but that tone, that precedent that he set, really shaped the rest of the franchise moving forward. And it was never really able to recover from that tonal dissonance that very few writers are able to balance well. I think that's one thing that Joss Whedon really does excel at. I'm in the middle of watching Buffy right now, which you can expect an episode about sometime in the near future, I hope. But he's really good at that. I think Brad Bird bolstering Simon Pegg's character was a logical way to go, seeing how he was really funny in small doses in the little bit that he was in Mission Impossible 3. But to make him almost like this constant quippy, reactionary joke teller wasn't surprising, especially for Simon Pegg as an actor. But I did feel like they were leaning a little too much on that in Ghost Protocol. And I think that, other than the pacing, I think that's my biggest gripe with that movie. Whereas, once Christopher McQuarrie got his hands on it, he really seemed to understand how to make all the characters, but Simon Pegg in particular, and Luther too, how to make them more grounded and realistic in context of this Mission Impossible universe, but still allow them to have a little bit more lighthearted and sometimes necessary tension melting, not always breaking moments, because that was natural to their characters. But it never detracted from the tension or the stakes of a scene. Never took me out of the scene or the moment or the movie. I just thought that McQuarrie had a little bit more respect for Simon Pegg's character, like a guy that was a technician that wanted to be in the field and then worked his way up to that and earned that, which isn't an easy task. So it shows that he has both mental and physical resolve and stamina to get to that point. And it paid off. He was able to hold his own as a field agent and be a valuable member of the team, not just the comedic relief. There was just so much good stuff in Fallout, and I was so riveted by it that I could just gush about it all day. But just a couple other quick things I wanted to note. I think what I had in my mind as one of the biggest overall flaws of the Mission Impossible franchise, or maybe just one thing it was lacking or missing, was the emotional buy-in to the characters. They've always been able to sprinkle in a good amount of moments and implications and hints at things just being a little deeper and below the surface in terms of what characters are feeling and how they relate to each other and the emotional stakes overall, of these stories. But like in the first one, things were much more implied than they were overt, which is fine because I think that fit the genre really well. And it made that movie stand alone as its own thing. But when you started adding sequels and expanding on these characters, obviously there's got to be more reason to keep telling these character stories beyond just the plot. At least to me, that's what makes like a good franchise. That was one thing that kept me invested in Marvel up until Endgame, was it seemed that the characters were evolving as the plot was pushing them to. So I was willing to stick with it and invest time and energy and money, even if there was a lot of generic, cliched, boring and redundant action and humor and plot devices and et cetera, et cetera. I thought it was really interesting to see, like Captain America go from where he started to where he got to in Endgame, to see Bruce Banner and Tony Stark and even Thor. There was story to keep being invested in moving forward until after Endgame. I wanted to hope that there was still story to tell, and there seemed like there could be, but it's really been squandered. And JJ has gotten a lot of praise over the years, and I totally agree with him that he did add that needed aspect to Ethan Hunt's character to have something more emotionally at stake than just the big, vague, abstract, like, oh, the world's in danger or the country or whatever. They made it personal, and that really helped with that. But once his wife, Michelle Monaghan's character, was out of the picture after number 3, on an emotional level, I just never felt like Hunt was the most compelling character. That's why I was surprised to find myself a little choked up at the end of Fallout. When I first saw it, it really didn't affect me. But like I said, I just wasn't as engaged or invested in it as I was this time. But that whole scene at the end where he's apologizing to Julia, I really felt the weight of that, because I was asking myself those same questions, especially by the time he realized that he got her back in danger again, and all those years of hiding and running on her part seemed to be for naught, because if he hadn't selfishly wanted to be with her and lied to her from the beginning, she never would have been put in danger at all. And now it just seemed like that's her fate, and it was all his fault. And then her response to that, about how it helped her grow and discover herself as a person and how happy she was, I thought that was really well written and unexpected emotional kind of gut punch, because it really validated all the movies and all the experiences that we've seen Ethan Hunt go through, even in his more detached kind of wrote like, I'm just a spy and this is what I got to do. It really put him up on a hero pedestal, even though he didn't feel it. As an audience member, I was like, wow, this guy really is, the legitimate hero of this franchise, but not alone. Obviously, his team and the teams that he's had over the years couldn't have done it without them. So these movies, in a way, are some of the best superhero movies and maybe one of the best superhero franchises ever, because we've now gotten direct in-story validation for how important their work is. Not that they just save the world, which is great and important, but on a character, emotional, interpersonal level, that was all paid off in this movie. And I think that's really clever because it kind of brings together and adds an emotional climax to everything that's come before, but it also puts Ethan Hunt's character in a new place of not being racked with guilt. And maybe, we'll see what happens at Dead Reckoning, but having like a new sense of purpose, knowing that he's seen, he's appreciated, he's understood. And the work that he and his team does is like literally makes people that he loves happy. I thought that was actually kind of powerful. And as much as, these other franchises, like, I'm sorry, but I just kept thinking of Fast and Furious compared to this because I got so numb to those movies over the years. I enjoyed them. Obviously, like a lot of people, I was totally unexpectedly blown away by the fifth one. So as the next few came out, I was totally on board to just see what nonsensical mania and zaniness they would get up to. And as much as they tried, bless their hearts, to like have all the family emotionality behind it, it was all so forced and unearned compared to something like Fallout, that though I really have not been excited to see Fast 9 or Fast X, because the last one I saw was the Fate of the Furious, which I thought was fine and it had its moments, but again, I was just really kind of burnt out after all the Marvel and Jurassic Worlds and Transformers of the action blockbuster genre over this past decade, that I wasn't rushing out to go see more of this stuff unless it was going to be worth my time and energy and had something to offer that was more than just like, hey, look, something went boom. And, that's what I had originally written Fallout off as. And I think it was a time and place issue because it had just come out during too much of that schlock. And I wasn't open-minded enough to appreciate it. And it sounds like, unfortunately, not totally the same context, but, it's been several years since then, and we've had so much more content since then in this same action thriller with humor sprinkled in genre, that it seems like audiences are not as excited about seeing Dead Reckoning as they were about Fallout. I'm sure there's a lot of other factors involved why it's not doing well in the box office, but I am really curious to see if it holds up to the multiple levels of quality that Christopher McQuarrie really brought to the franchise and really brought to a head in Fallout, where he brought together everything that made this franchise work great, from the spy to the thriller to the suspense to the tension to the action. And in this one, using all of that to add an emotional impact and depth to the characters. I am really curious to see where he goes from here with the next two Mission Impossible, Dead Reckoning Part 1 and Part 2. So I'm going to go see that and then report back and wrap this thing up. As of recording this, I finally got to see my first Mission Impossible in a theater since had to be like the late 90s, maybe early 2000s. Just the other night when I saw Dead Reckoning Part 1. And I got to say, for the first half-ish, I wasn't quite sure where it was going or how I felt about it, but by the end, it totally had me. And that seems to be a Chris McQuarrie thing in general, looking back over his filmography, he's one of those filmmakers and writers that seems to bank on audiences being in it for the long haul, not needing to necessarily be hooked by one major, simple, straightforward story point or character thing like right off the bat. He sprinkles stuff in and allows it to build and then come back around. He really likes to build these narrative puzzles where you're not quite sure what you're in store for until he shows you. So though I agree with the general consensus that this movie was really, really good, but not quite as good as Fallout, I think that's a little bit of a misnomer. And I think all the Mission Impossible movies, it's a little unfair to compare them on a one-on-one basis, even though they are in the same franchise, so of course they're going to be compared. But they really all have been their own thing. Even though the Chris McQuarrie run has been more direct sequels to the last than any of the other ones have, even so, he has done a really, really good job, I think, of making a unique experience with its own vision and not just being like a rehash or retread of what he did last time and what worked. He's willing to experiment, but in more subtle ways. So, to be more specific, what really struck me about Dead Reckoning standing on its own was that it, at least on first viewing, because I've only seen it once now and I can't wait to see it again, but it was, to me, the most heady and existential and philosophical and more thematically heavy than any of the other movies. So in that regard, I do understand why people are saying, or critics are saying, that it's not as good as Fallout, because Fallout was a lot more straightforward, I guess. Also, this being part one of two, there's always that. We don't have the whole picture yet. And even though this did feel like a complete story in and of itself, definitely was a lot of setup and a lot of sprinkling in of things that are going to come into play later for sure. Like Ethan's backstory, the entity is definitely was used more sparsely and subtly and in the background than I'm guessing it's going to be in the next one. And on that note, I really liked how I thought it was really smart narratively how they personified the entity with the Gabriel character and the I forgot her name in the movie, but the woman that plays Mantis in Marvel, how they were kind of like the physical stand-in. They were like the Jesus of the god of the entity. So that made it a lot less abstract and not just like this digital nerve endings in the sky or whatever, this ambiguous and abstract algorithmic force that's kind of really hard to visualize. I thought they did a really good job of not worrying about that yet and making it more about the people and their interactions and how this thing was a catalyst for a lot of socio-political fallout, if you will. But anyway, like I was saying, I think that comparing this on a one-to-one basis to Fallout is not really fair because it is a different movie. It's a different kind of story. And I think I enjoyed this one just as much as Fallout. So in that regard, I would say Rogue Nation, Fallout, and Dead Reckoning are all equally good. But like I pointed out, at least in my experience, I felt that Rogue Nation was a little bit more about, at least in the way that it was presented and executed, was more about how the subversion of the action genre, especially climactically, and then Fallout was all-out action. This one was a lot more like calculated, almost like a chess game of action, whereas like in Fallout, when he goes after Henry Cavill in the helicopter, that's all circumstantial. He just has to put in brute force and has to like teach himself to fly a helicopter in the moment. You know, it's not as planned out. They just know that they have this objective of having to find the bombs, defuse the bombs. But in Dead Reckoning, and that's why I think the title is so brilliant, I'll come back to that, it was a lot more of like this intricate, calculated game they were playing, and all these pieces involved, all these players moving around the board. And in that way, to me, it felt a lot more like a Mission Impossible kind of movie, like the first one, where it was more about who knows what and what's really going on, who's conscious of the whole plan, who's just playing their part, who's being manipulated, who's the manipulator,
even though there was like an amazing climactic action scene with the train. And I loved how I turned to my wife a couple times during the movie and was like, oh, there goes Ethan running again. There goes, another motorcycle chase and all that kind of stuff. Even though they were tropes and they were cliches, they were used so well and so fresh. But even so, with all that going on, with that huge, bombastic, like visually stunning, intense train scene again, because yes, they're on a train again, just like the first one, but totally different context this time, and a lot more players at play. There was so much more going on underneath the surface than like in number 3 or even in Fallout, where the objectives weren't as clear and the consequences of success or failure weren't as clear. And that's why I enjoyed this one on its own merits, even though I thought Fallout was nearly perfect, having watched it again. This one did feel a little bit more bursting at the seams, a little bit more, I don't know, bloated is a word that's thrown around a lot. I don't know if it was unnecessarily full, but it did feel a little bit more messy, maybe, especially when it came to like Rebecca Ferguson's character. I was really, really sad to see her go. I thought she was like the best addition to the series since Ethan. But on an intellectual level, on a narrative level, I did understand why that had to go that way. And, as usual, this is part 1, so we don't know if that's the end of her story or not. But I found myself kind of questioning things like that. Like, did that need to really go down like that? I guess we won't really know until part 2. But just as this movie on its own, some things felt like they may have been a little bordering on extraneous, but again, I can't tell yet for sure. But overall, this movie kind of caught me and hooked me and thrilled me in similar yet distinct ways from the other movies. And I got to say, watching them all now, all 7 in a row in the course of like 2 weeks, every single movie did that. Every single movie succeeded in that at least. Even the second one had its own feel and stood apart and kind of had its own way of executing its themes without feeling like it was just retreading or stepping on the toes of the installments that came before it. So that's kind of amazing, especially for a franchise that was not planned out from the beginning. It's not like Harry Potter or something where, say what you will about those stories and all of their flaws, there was a beginning, middle, and end to the scope of the original run of the books that they translated into film. So of course they were all going to kind of have their own feel and momentum moving through it. But something like Mission Impossible, and I know I keep going back to Fast and Furious, but like Fast and the Furious just feels like they keep just tacking on stuff. Like they keep adding in these totally arbitrary and random and obviously just contrived on the spot, like half brothers and weird connections to people that, obviously weren't planned from the beginning. And that's why bringing in a little flashback of Ethan's backstory and having this seemingly, who knows, professional or love interest or somebody that he was tied to, and now knowing that, he had this nefarious past before he was recruited and absolved from whatever he had done before he was an IMF agent. And again, I can't make any judgments on that until we see part 2, but at first that seemed like that typical unplanned franchise issue where you shove in stuff that you're like, well, why didn't we know about this beforehand? But if you look at the whole series, we don't really know anything about Ethan before IMF. The first movie especially does really no character development. And again, I know I said this about Fallout, but that was one of the biggest issues, I think, hindering me from looking at this franchise more fondly, even though I was always interested in it just because it was so entertaining overall, was the emotional stakes and the heart of it felt lacking. But like I said, Fallout really kind of brought it all around and retroactively added a lot of that to it. And now this one, I thought, did a really good job of making it even more, of upping the inner conflict emotional stakes for everybody, but especially Ethan, because now we have this antagonist, the entity, that is using human psychology and emotional relations as part of its manipulation against us, against the characters. So I really felt for everybody and the impossible positions that they were put in, like Ethan having to choose between Grace, who I totally recognize the actress, but without the red hair, I didn't realize that it was the Peggy Carter lady until after I looked her up, and Rebecca Ferguson's character. And just Ethan's undying compulsion to protect everybody from a small scale interpersonal level, from like his team and love interest to the whole world. All of that is really kind of laid bare in this one because the entity knows that that's his weakness and it's looking to exploit it. And that was something that I was really interested in, how they were going to make Dead Reckoning feel like a worthy installment that justify its existence after Fallout seeming... I mean, I think they could have totally ended the series on Fallout, and this whole idea that, you know, Ethan was our kind of superhero character that was always going to be there, sort of like our Batman of the whole world, was going to be watching over us, and that it was a good thing, and that he learned that lesson too, so he didn't have to carry all that guilt, that big burden of guilt that he had for the other movies. That felt like enough of an emotional climax to the series that they could have ended it there if they wanted it to. I would have been fine leaving it there, and that's why I was a little worried going into Dead Reckoning that it was just going to feel unnecessary, tacked on, you know, just another sequel just to keep the franchise going. But I got to say, like, Chris McQuarrie is quickly becoming one of my favorite writers and filmmakers because he's so good behind the camera, but he's also so good at writing scripts that matter, that feel like worthy to be made into a movie. So far, I have not seen something from him, whether it was just him as the screenwriter or him as the writer-director or just the director, that felt like phoned in or, you know, a paycheck project. The only thing that overtly didn't quite work for me, or that took me out of the movie a little bit for the first time since number 4, Ghost Protocol, because of Brad Bird's tricky balance of intense action and humor. Like I said previously, I feel like Chris McQuarrie did an excellent job of recognizing Benji's character specifically as a humorous character, but also fleshing him out as a more three-dimensional person and foil for Luther and for Ethan, as opposed to just being a punchline. And actually in this one too, I think that Chris McQuarrie still did a good job reeling in his character and the actor and his tendency to kind of overact and rely too much on, you know, humorous moments undercutting his potential to be a more well-rounded character. But in general, even though I did find it amusing, there were a lot of really good chuckles throughout the movie, especially between Ethan and Grace, especially during that car chase in the little yellow Fiat. There were a few moments that were played a little bit too squarely just for laughs. Just like some shots, like the looks they would exchange when they were like, oh boy, here we go again kind of thing, or how do we get ourselves in this mess expressions, or it's a little bit too much of silliness during these high stakes, really intense action scenes. And again, I know that's just Hollywood's way of making stuff like this more accessible to wider audiences. But Ethan has been so dour and stoic for the past several films, which I'm totally fine with, by the way, because that's his character and he has every reason to be. He's holding the world on his shoulders. And that's why having a little bit more lightheartedness from Simon Pegg and Ving Rhames made a lot of sense. With everything that he was going through in this movie and everything that was at stake because of the entity and the world power's reaction to it, I felt that it was a little out of place for Ethan to be kind of like cracking jokes and playing down the heaviness of these situations, these life and death situations that he was in. By the end, and the train scene, I thought that all kind of went away and it was good. But during the middle of the movie, especially during the car chase, like I said, when they were handcuffed, I really like how all the Mission Impossible movies have done a good job, for the most part, of upping the stakes, not just within the plot in a big picture, but how like a lot of their action scenes, they'll be going along and you think like it's going to go a certain way, and then they throw in some curveball where the objective is the same, but they've added more complications, pinches as they call them in the industry, that make you as an audience member go like, oh man, this was hard enough on its own and now they have to deal with this. So like, you know, the sandstorm in Ghost Protocol, or Ethan not knowing exactly how to fly a helicopter in Fallout. And in this one, the handcuff thing was really brilliant because it added a layer of tension to an already super intense car chase. But then there was all this wry, deadpan humor throughout it, and it just felt a little out of place. And again, I'm sure they did it because the movie in general was so intense and there were so many suspenseful and tension-building moments that they were just trying to break the ice a little bit, lighten things up. But if you look at Rogue Nation, for instance, I just don't think it's necessary in this series. I think things being as crazy as they are in this series, and just your like constant, or my constant reaction is like, oh my God, how are they gonna, that's insane. Oh my God, that stunt, that car crash, that blah, blah, blah. I don't need to be laughing during that too, because I'm already on the edge of my seat and like having a visceral reaction to the action and the stakes anyway. That was the biggest flaw in Fallout to me, and that was the biggest flaw in this one to me. But it did not by any means like ruin the experience or totally take me out of it. It was just kind of like, all right, I'll go with this, but I don't need it. But overall, I thought the movie was incredible, and I can't wait for the next one. And I'm really, really bummed that audiences didn't come out for this one like they did for the last few, because this franchise has been on an upwards trajectory. And even though I know that there's, COVID delays and everything, and it's been a while, 2018 to 2023, so it's been 5-ish years since the last one. I think like the biggest break they've had since between 3 and 4. So I'm sure there's a lot of factors involved, but there does seem to be some hubris with the release date and how they could have easily taken it out of the midsummer pile-on, especially after seeing Indiana Jones and Fast and Furious bomb or underperform or whatever, and all the superhero stuff, Flash, Quantumania, bomb or underperform, for instance, and then seeing Barbie and Oppenheimer, a existential comedy satire, and Oppenheimer being like a 3-hour brooding period piece drama thriller. It seems like audiences wanted something fresh, and they were getting a little tired of just generic action that's been churned out over and over and over again for the past 10 years especially, but 15, 20 years overall, really since X-Men kind of changed the game. It makes sense to me that stuff like Barbie and Oppenheimer would be such a breath of fresh air to audiences, because they are very different than what Hollywood has been spoon-feeding us. And I feel like because of all that, Dead Reckoning just got kind of lost in the shuffle. And the most unfortunate part to me is that watching all of these movies now, I think this is a good note to end on, with the exception of 2 and 3 especially, even though I really enjoyed 3 for what it is, but it is just more of like a shoot-'em-up action movie than anything really Mission Impossible-y, except for maybe the gala infiltration scene in the middle where they're kidnapping Philip Seymour Hoffman. But 1 and then 4 on have been some of the best highbrow action that I think we've had since, like I said before, like Edge of Tomorrow and 90s and 80s and 90s James Cameron and stuff like that. This isn't just dumb explosion for explosion's sake action or storytelling. It has intention and purpose and really interesting thematic content, and now as it's gone on, like really interesting developed 3-dimensional characters that are put into really narratively good and high stakes plots that challenge them. I think it's everything that a good blockbuster should be, and I wonder if because of all the schlock that's come out for so long now and has gotten so generic, that mainstream, just kind of wider movie-going audiences forgot that Mission Impossible is like the highest caliber balance between popcorn, blockbuster, big action fun, and actually like really good quality, big budget Hollywood storytelling and filmmaking. It's all of those things all in one. And we don't see films like this very often, so it's a real bummer to me that it didn't succeed at the box office. And I hope it doesn't affect anything about part 2. I hope they don't try to like change course, or the studio steps in and tells McQuarrie and Cruise like what they can and can't do with it, or when it's going to be released and stuff like that. I think based on the track record until this movie, I think it would be good to trust the vision and the instincts of McQuarrie and Cruise and their production team, and let them hopefully finish out this series without being interfered with and micromanaged, because obviously we've seen over and over again that that is not the way towards quality productions or successful productions, economically speaking. These filmmakers had a vision going into these movies, and I don't want to see that stifled or squandered just because they had a misstep of when they decided to release this one and how they decided to market it, I guess. It deserves better, and I hope when it gets to digital and streaming that it does find an audience and it gets the recognition it deserves, and that by the time we get to part 2, it'll be back on top. And who knows, maybe like Marvel and Star Wars and Indiana Jones and Jurassic Park and Transformers and all these, and Fast and Furious and all these franchises that have been dwindling will not affect the visage and success of the Mission Impossible series. And I hope that it can end on a high note if they are shooting for the end here, and that it will rise above its flaccid competition, because it absolutely deserves to. So thanks for coming along on this unexpected ride a couple weeks ago of me going back through the Mission Impossible movies and ranting about my thoughts and reactions to them. I have so many projects in the works and recorded that I need to get to edit that I was not planning on this at all. But knowing that Dead Reckoning was in theaters, and my wife one day saying that she had only seen 1 and 2, and then seeing that they were all available on Paramount Plus, I was like, all right, this is the perfect time to revisit this series. And I wasn't sure if I was going to make a podcast about it, but I did have such strong reactions to it, mostly positive, that I would be remiss not to take this opportunity to document my thoughts on all this. So thanks again, and I'm really curious about your thoughts on everything, theories about Dead Reckoning Part 2, and any other conversations that we could get into about this. I'm always up for that, and you can find all the different ways to interact with me at breathingunderwater.us.